Okay, so let's dive into this. The source material we're looking at today paints a pretty um, intense picture of events in Los Angeles.
Yeah, really intense. Talks about tear gas, fireworks, crowd dispersal.
And the language used is really strong. I mean, the source says all hell breaks loose and even claims the Trump regime quite literally declared war on its own citizens. Heavy stuff.
Definitely strong claims. And the source puts forward a very specific narrative, doesn't it? It argues this wasn't just random unrest.
Right. It claims it was actually provoked deliberately by federal actions, specifically IC raids.
Which then, according to the source, led to this federal response involving the National Guard.
Exactly. And that's our goal here in this deep dive, right? To guide you, the listener, through this specific source. We're not adding our opinions, just unpacking what this source claims happened.
What sequence of events it describes, the legal arguments it makes.
And also how it presents the different ways various people frame the situation. It's all about understanding the perspective of this source.
And it jumps right into that central claim about provocation. The source uses words like manufactured, provoked, blaming the Trump regime for sending an ICE.
Yeah, and it gets really specific about who it says ICE was targeting. It makes a point to say, look, these weren't criminals or gang members.
No, the source explicitly says peaceful, hardworking migrants. That's the description used.
And it lists examples of where these alleged raids happened.
It does. Places like apparel factories, people just working. Also courthouses.
Courthouses, where people were already in the legal process.
Exactly. People supposedly going through lawful process for asylum or immigration claims. It also mentions neighborhoods, even Home Depot parking lots.
And the source frames this targeting specifically towards hardworking Latino families.
And it gives a timeline, too. Says it kicked off Friday in downtown L.A.
And then spread out on Saturday.
Yeah, expanded into nearby areas in L.A. County. Places like Paramount, Santa Fe, Compton, Torrance are mentioned.
What about the tactics? Does the source describe how these alleged raids were carried out?
It does, and again, the descriptions are quite stark. Waiting in bushes, snatching people going to court. That's the word the source uses. And it mentions grabbing kids, even babies, and uses very strong language, again, calling it infliction of torture.
Wow. So the source draws a direct line, then, from these alleged ICE actions to the unrest.
Absolutely. It says these actions were pissing off the community, that this directly caused the social unrest or societal unrest.
And the reason given is that families were being broken up, people disappeared, potentially sent back to dangerous situations.
Right. That's the connection the source makes, and then it moves on to describe the unrest itself.
Okay, what does it say about those scenes?
Well, it mentions videos apparently showing what it calls less than lethal rounds being used on protesters.
But it notes those can still be dangerous, right? Lethal even.
It does make that point, yes, that less than lethal doesn't mean harmless.
And specific locations.
It mentions Paramount specifically, near a Home Depot, as a site for some of these protest scenes. It describes tactics like gas canisters, pepper balls, things affecting the senses.
Sensory effects, okay.
It also references footage from the Citizen app, that app people use to report things locally.
Huh? Yeah.
And says there's also video showing community resistance.
But here's an interesting nuance. The source also comments on the size of the protests, doesn't it?
It does. It says they were somewhat sizable, but qualifies that by saying they weren't huge, massive.
And based on that assessment, the source argues what?
That California's own police, like LAPD or the Highway Patrol, could have handled it. That federal intervention wasn't necessary from a crowd control standpoint.
Which leads us directly to the federal response, as the source tells it.
Right. According to the source, the Trump regime reacted to this unrest by issuing a specific memo.
And the source adds that little detail about Trump being in a UFC fight when it happened.
Yeah, it includes that detail. The memo itself, the title is long, Department of Defense Security for the Protection of Department of Homeland Security Functions Memo.
Okay. And the main action in that memo?
Federalizing the California National Guard. That's the key takeaway, according to the source.
How many troops does it say?
It cites specifics from the memo. At least 2,000 Guard personnel.
And for how long?
For 60 days initially, but potentially longer, at the discretion of the Secretary of Defense. The source identifies him as Pete Hegseth.
Got it. And the legal justification the feds supposedly used?
The source says they invoked Title 10 U.S. Code, specifically Section 12406.
Okay, 10 U.S.C. 12406.
Yeah.
And this is where the source really focuses its legal argument.
Exactly. This is central. The source claims invoking that specific law here was entirely inapplicable, calls the whole action invalid and unlawful.
Why? What's the reasoning?
Well, the source breaks down the statute, 10 U.S.C. 12406. It says the law lists specific conditions for its use. Basically, 3 things. 1, an actual invasion by a foreign nation. 2, a rebellion against U.S. authority. Or 3, a situation where the president just can't enforce federal laws using regular forces.
And the source argues
That none of those conditions were met. Simple as that. No invasion, no rebellion, no proof the president couldn't use other means. So the source concludes the legal basis wasn't there.
that's a pretty direct challenge to the legality.
It is, and the source adds another point from the statute. It claims the law requires orders to go through the governors of the states.
Involving the state leadership.
Right, and the source flatly states that did not happen here. Another reason it claims the action was unlawful.
And how did the governor react, according to the source? Governor Newsom.
The source mentions his reaction, yeah. Says Newsom called Trump's action wholly improper
Okay.
and accused Trump of trying to sow chaos and made it clear he was very much against it.
So the state leadership was pushing back, according to this account.
That's what the source reports. And there's one more legal point the source brings up about the memo itself.
What's that?
The memo apparently mentioned the Secretary of Defense could potentially use any other members of the regular armed forces if needed.
Meaning, like, Army, Marines, not just the National Guard.
Exactly. And the source argues that is not permitted under 10 U.S.C. 12406. It interprets that section as only authorizing the federalization of the Guard, not deploying active duty military against civilians domestically in this way.
Okay, that's a significant distinction they're making.
It is. Now, it's also really important how the source contrasts its own narrative with how other figures were framing the situation. The descriptions are starkly different.
Right, because context and framing matter hugely. Who does the source mention?
Well, Stephen Miller, for instance. The source cites him calling the events an insurrection against the laws and sovereignty of the United States. Very different language.
Insurrection.
Okay.
Who else?
Tom Homan, mentioned as appearing on TV, talking about activating or federalizing the Guard.
And Trump himself.
The source includes a post attributed to Donald Trump. It says he blamed Governor Newsom and LA Mayor Karen Bass for not handling riots and looters.
Okay.
And essentially said the federal government would step in and solve the problem.
And then there's Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense mentioned earlier. His framing seems particularly strong in the source material.
Extremely strong. The source identifies him also as a former Fox host and quotes his post describing the events as violent mob assaults on IC and federal law enforcement.
Assaults.
And claiming the goal was to stop the removal of criminal illegal aliens. Again, a very different picture than the source's initial description of peaceful migrants.
Wow. So the framing war was intense.
It definitely seems that way, according to this source. Hegseth's post, as cited, goes even further. He reportedly called it a dangerous invasion facilitated by criminal cartels, a.k.a. foreign terrorist organizations.
Invasion,
Yeah.
cartels, terrorist organizations.
That's
A major escalation in rhetoric.
huge escalation, and framed it as a huge national security risk. His post apparently said the DoD was mobilizing the Guard immediately.
Okay, so that immediate mobilization ties back to the memo. But there was something else in Hegseth's reported post that the source found alarming.
Yes, this is a key point the source emphasizes. Hegseth's post allegedly included a threat if the violence continued.
Right.
Active duty Marines at Camp Pendleton will also be mobilized, and it added they were on high alert.
Active duty Marines
Mm-hmm.
against people in Los Angeles.
That's how the source presents it. And its interpretation is severe. It calls this specific statement a declaration of war against the United States.
A declaration of war.
That's the source's language. It sees it as a direct threat to use the U.S. military against U.S. citizens in California. And the source uses this to argue that this outcome, military intervention, was something the federal government wanted from the very beginning.
Implying the initial events were engineered to reach this point.
That seems to be the implication the source is making, yes,
Yeah.
that they were looking for an excuse.
Now, the source doesn't just leave it there. It tries to place these LA events into a bigger picture, right? A broader theory.
It does. It connects the timing of all this to other things happening around mid-June, specifically Donald Trump's birthday, June 14th.
Okay, how does that connect?
And it also mentions a planned event the source calls a dictator military parade set for Washington, D.C. around that same time.
A military parade.
That's what the source calls it. And it adds another layer. June 14th was also the date for planned protests across the country called the No Kings protests.
Ah, so multiple things converging on that date.
Right, and the source expected those protests to be very large. So here's the theory it puts forward.
What's the connection it's drawing?
The source suggests that this whole escalation in LA, the alleged ICE provocation, the unrest, federalizing the guard, threatening Marines, might have been an intentional effort.
An effort to do what?
To create a situation that could justify imposing martial law, or at least using the military to broadly suppress the population. Military to suppress everyone is the phrase used.
And the timing suggests this was potentially linked to the parade or the expected protests.
That's the source's theory, that maybe the goal was to showcase dictatorship power, put down dissent before those large protests or during the parade. The source strongly believes the timing isn't just a coincidence.
Okay, so quite a complex theory connecting local events to national political displays.
It's definitely a comprehensive narrative that the source builds.
So let's just recap what we've pulled from this specific source. It starts with claims of provocative ICE raids targeting specific non-criminal groups.
Leading to community anger and unrest, described with specific scenes, but also noted as not massive.
Followed by the federal government invoking a specific law, 10 U.S.C. 12406, to federalize the National Guard.
Which the source then argues, point by point, was an unlawful and invalid use of that statute.
Right. And we saw the source contrast its own account with the very different, often harsher framings used by figures like Miller, Holman, Trump, and especially Hegseth.
Including that threat, cited from Hegseth, to potentially use active duty Marines, which the source called a declaration of war.
And finally, the source ties it all together with his broader theory about political motives, June 14th, a potential military parade, and suppressing dissent.
Yeah, it's a very detailed and obviously very critical perspective presented in this source material.
Absolutely. This deep dive really highlights how one source can construct a narrative around disputed events, focusing heavily on alleged provocation and legal arguments.
It definitely gives you, the listener, a lot to think about. And it leads to a final question for you, really.
Yeah.
When you come across stories like this one, with conflict between federal and state power and these really different accounts of what happened on the ground, what details, what specific points like the legal arguments or the claims of provocation we saw here do you think are the most important things to look for? What helps you try to understand what might actually be going on?